We're at the anniversary of September 11th once again, and it's the first one since the attacks by Hamas in Israel on October 7th. One remarkable fact is that since October 7th, there has been almost no discussion of the connection between these two catastrophic events. One of the worst attacks on American soil, the most deadly attack, and Israel's most deadly attack from its adversaries in the Palestinian territories from Gaza. There is a connection, however, between these two, and that is what we're going to explore today in the podcast. Joining me today is Onkar Ghate, and we're going to look at the important and under-recognized connection between America's response to 9/11 and what we've been seeing in Israel since October 7th, and here in the US with responses to those attacks. Onkar, welcome. Why don't we dive in and talk about the connection? What is the connection in your mind here?
The connection that's been made is what I've seen is basically this, that one should think of October 7th as Israel's 9/11, that the scale of the attack, the number of murders in proportion to the population, it's a scale of attack that was similar to 9/11 for America and its bigger population. But that's it. Like it's no that well 9/11 came first. It came 20 years before. We had both in the US, but more broadly, you can think the Western world had a response to 9/11. And there's been so little discussion and analysis of maybe that response has paved the road for October 7th. Any real analysis of our response to 9/11, I think, has to be that it failed. And we talked about that. We did a podcast in the kind of chaotic, depressing withdrawal from Afghanistan, and of thinking of that as a capstone of our policy in regard, or our response in regard to 9/11. And if that didn't single out that it's failed, we failed in our response, that October 7th, and it is true, it's an attack on the scale of 9/11 in Israel, that happened. If Afghanistan and its withdrawal didn't convince you that the policy and response has failed, this should have convinced you. And we're way past the time for some serious analysis and soul searching or mind searching of how did we conceive of our response? What did we do? And why did it fail? And part of the failure is it's in certain ways has empowered the people trying to kill Americans, Israelis, Westerners. And I think if you look at Hamas, that has to be the analysis. And so few people were willing even to sort of raise those questions, to look into it. And that is part of what is both, I think, depressing and scary about the aftermath of October 7th.
Why don't we sketch out a bit about the American response to 9/11 so many years ago and how one should evaluate it? Because you're making the claim that it was a failure, and I agree with that, but I think it's important to see both how it was positioned at the time, what America was supposed to be accomplishing, what it should accomplish, and where we are today. And I think that that's something we at the Institute have been talking about since day one, since immediately after the attacks. And even before, we were signaling that there's a threat coming from the Middle East. So one of the important things that people have conveniently forgotten, depending on where they stand, is the epic scale of what America's goals were as they were announced by the Bush administration. Now, there's a lot of things to say about how America responded, and we've written a lot about this. We've got a book that came out a few years ago, Failing to Confront Islamic Totalitarianism, that you and I edited. And before that, there was a book of essays, Winning the Unwinnable War, where we lay out our analysis going all the way back to 2001. But to put it in brief, the Bush administration had many accounts of what it was trying to do in the Middle East, but they settled on, we're going to go into the Middle East and bring elections. This was called the Forward Strategy of Freedom. We characterize it as a crusade for democracy. And I think that's the right way to think of it. It was a messianic, religious, detached from reality strategy. the important thing to understand is that the Bush administration really took it seriously. They really thought that by bringing elections, simply bringing elections, the trappings of a free society, that would bring the Middle East into a better place politically, and ultimately, as they argued, that would prevent future Islamist attacks against us. Now, I'm putting it in those terms. That was not how the Bush administration put it. One of the things to recall here, just to sketch in the context, is there was a significant effort all the way through not to identify who it is that we're actually facing. They really did not call them the Islamists or the Islamist threat. That was something that was part of the strategy of not identifying who it is we're trying to deal with. And that was a way of making more plausible to themselves the idea that if only you brought elections, that would be enough, to ignore the actual beliefs and commitments of people in the region. Now, that's some of the setup. And then what actually happened is that this was the goal of this, as the Bush administration saw it, is they're going to rid the world of tyranny. They're going to bring democracy everywhere. And the Middle East was the start, and Iraq was particularly supposed to be the tidal wave of bringing freedom to the Middle East. Afghanistan was brought in under the same strategy. And in both cases, that was not what happened. It was predictable that that was not what would happen, as we predicted, and we were borne out by the fact. So in Iraq, it brought to power Islamist parties. In Afghanistan, it literally brought more a regime that was predicated on Islam. And eventually, as we saw in the withdrawal and since the withdrawal in Afghanistan, Afghanistan is basically where it was on September 10th, 2001. The Taliban are back in power. Women are now again objects and chattel. There is no freedom for them. It's just a complete relapse. And again, it is a colossal failure. And I'm skipping over a lot of the details of what unfolded here. So I think when you look at it in broad strokes, what was announced as the goal of bringing democracy to the Middle East, and that would create a safer world, safer for America in particular, and for the West, that was not even close to what actually happened. And the only beneficiaries of this forward strategy of freedom were the Islamists, who gained more power. And in many cases, as in Iraq and Afghanistan, they entered government. And this sets up what happened in the Palestinian territories with Hamas in joining the political process. And I think I just want to pause before we get into that. Is there anything you want to add to that overview?
I want to add a little bit about the philosophic drivers here that I think what was going on. So, I mean, you'll well remember this. You're putting it, the strategy was this forward strategy of freedom, but that came a little bit later. It was put more as and this is one slogan that was used: end states that sponsor terrorism. So we're going to dramatically change course. We've been in the past at best, like pre 9/11, at best, when American soldiers and American interests were attacked, a little bit of retaliation and then hoping it will go back to the status quo. And here it was, no, we can't keep doing that. We have to bring to an end the very states that are arming the terrorists, funding the terrorists, training the terrorists, and giving the terrorists their mission. That's what we were going to do. There was more and more outcry. Well, that's a selfish thing to do. You're going to end your enemies. You're going to bring them to an end. That's not right. That's not good. And Bush, who's both religious and altruistic, and in the end they go together, he was worried about that criticism. Yeah, we can't do that. And even just end states that sponsor terrorism, part of the reason it couldn't work is you have to identify the states that are sponsoring terrorism. And that would be to identify, well, Iran is the fountainhead because it's committed to a religious ideology that it's trying to spread by the gun throughout the Middle East. And they wouldn't do that because Bush thinks, and immediately after 9/11, it was, well, but religion's on the side of the good. Religion is a force for the good. At most, there's some kind of people who distorted the peaceful religion of Islam. So you couldn't even identify the states that sponsor terrorism on this. And then it's, well, but it's selfish to just end your enemy. So it's okay, no, we're not doing it for us. We're going to bring freedom to the Middle East. We're doing it for them. So it was a dramatic change to the justification of the policy and of our response, and therefore of the nature of the response. He was serious about what we're going to do is bring freedom. And notice the equation. We're going to bring, so it's the Ford strategy of freedom. But as you were saying, in the way you were describing it as well, it was we're going to bring democracy, as though democracy and freedom mean the same thing. And then it was, and we're going to bring election. They're going to be able to vote for, and they were asked, the Bush administration and Bush himself were asked explicitly, what happens if they vote in killers? What happens if they vote in terrorists? And the response was something like, democracy is democracy. And so the equation that what freedom means is just going to the ballot box and voting for whoever you want, including killers, that's such a philosophic bankruptcy that a president and administration of the US could think that, but that basically all the citizens in the country would not say, but that's outrageous. That's not what freedom means. It was, oh, okay, I guess that's what freedom is. And it has to be thought of as like this, to the extent that there was ideological thinking and trying to have a strategy that has a set of principles. This is what it was, and the reasons for it. It was an altruistic attempt to bring freedom with zero understanding of what freedom is. And that's what our strategy was in the Middle East. And part of the reason we were saying it will end in disaster is if that's the intellectual backbone of your strategy, it has to end in disaster.
Yeah, and just to underline your observation that the way the response to 9/11 is remembered is exactly the opposite. It was too assertive. America was too concerned with its interest. And there's a narrative that you hear from some places. This was all about America getting its hands on Iraqi oil and taking over the Middle East and having imperial ambitions. And none of that was even remotely true. And that wouldn't be my justification for any of those, for that policy. But if that were the policy, that would be several degrees healthier than what actually happened. And it would be much more credible that you would accomplish something. But that wasn't even remotely true. And this goes to, just to put it in a nutshell, the way that we analyzed this at the time. And since then, our position was that it was the philosophic ideas dominating in that policy, that animated that policy, that was what weakened America, that made it impossible for America to succeed in the Middle East, and succeed here in the rational sense of defeating its enemies and making Americans safer, protecting the lives and freedom of Americans. And that's what was not done. And in fact, as you're suggesting, this had to end in disaster. And indeed, it did. So I indicated briefly that in Iraq, it was Islamist parties that came to power. And Iraq became a state that was beholden to Iran, its neighbor, because Iran pushed many of the parties there, and they were aligned with Iran. So Iran was the main beneficiary of the elections in Iraq, and it has been for many years. And then what happens, and this is where Bush's vision of this being a tidal wave of democracy and blurring that with freedom, this was supposed to usher in a new Middle East, and it did, but not in the way that was supposed to, not in the way that we were told. So then there were elections. I'm not going to do this exactly chronologically, but the key places to look at since Iraq and Afghanistan that had elections, and in both of those countries, there were new constitutions, and in both cases, the constitutions were a betrayal of freedom, not an embrace of it. Then there are parliamentary elections in Egypt under pressure from the United States. And what happened is that the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamist party that's been around for most of the 20th century, it has such a strong showing in the elections. It gained so many seats, and this is under a military dictatorship, that it scared them. It scared the United States, scared the Egyptians, and they backed away from having more elections in Egypt. There were elections in Lebanon, and who gained the most power? Who gained more political strength? It was Hezbollah, which is the Islamist faction that dominates southern Lebanon and dominates the government, and is allied with Iran. And then this brings us to, and there were other cases too, but the most significant one that we should talk about tying this to October 7th is in the Palestinian territories. So this was an explicit decision by the U.S. administration, the Bush administration. They said to the Israelis, the Palestinians are due for an election, a parliamentary election, and we insist that Hamas be allowed to take part in these elections. Now, remember, people have become much more familiar with Hamas now since October 7th, but back then it was no less evil. It was just as evil. It had committed many atrocities on a smaller scale, albeit, but it was known to be a murderous organization with a mission, a founding mission of destroying a free society, which is Israel. So this is 2005, 2006. People in the United States were saying, in response to the Bush administration, this doesn't make sense. This is not a party that believes in elections. They don't really view themselves as governing through democratic processes. It's just, it would be surprising if they agreed to take part in the elections. And others were saying, rightly, again, these people are killers. Why would you allow them to take part in elections? This might be the last elections that ever happened here. And these are not just people who are, I wouldn't even characterize them as pro-Israeli or pro anything. They were just people who knew enough about Hamas to say, this doesn't smell right. This doesn't make any sense to us. And within Israel, there was opposition to this as well, because Hamas is not a party that's welcomed in any kind of political process, because they are a extra political movement that is trying to overthrow a free society. But it was at the instigation of the United States, at the urging and I think arm twisting of the US, that the Israelis allowed Hamas to take part in these elections. And what was the result? The expected result from the Bush administration, based on their fantasy strategy, this myth and religiously inflected policy, was everyone in their heart, deep down, has a God-given desire for freedom. And so given the opportunity, when the shackles are removed, people will vote for freedom. That was the mythology that the Bush administration told itself and told other people. What actually happened is that the reality in the Middle East is nothing like that. It's just false that people have an innate desire for freedom. Wanting and valuing freedom as an achievement, it's a choice. And in fact, in the Middle East, and in Palestinian terrorism in particular, the dominant ideas are Islamic totalitarianism and various forms of it, of which Hamas is a representative. So Hamas is an Islamic totalitarian faction. Indeed, it won a landslide in those elections. And so what unfolds at America's urging, so America's policy was in effect empowering Hamas to enter Palestinian parliamentary elections and succeed phenomenally. This then unfolds into a power struggle within the Palestinian factions. It's a bloody civil war between them. And the upshot is that by 2006, 2007, Hamas has taken over Gaza. It's killed off and ejected the rival parties in the Palestinian movement. And Hamas has created a new Islamist regime. It's trying to Islamize the whole society. It acquires more weapons, and it launches, as promised and as its mission commands it to, it launches a rocket war soon after that. And so there's a direct line between America's policy towards the Middle East after 9/11, this whole conception of bringing democracy to the region, ignoring the nature of the Islamist movement, evading the nature of the Islamist movement, and then pushing Islamists into having greater power in the region, to the point where Hamas, by 2007, is in a position to launch its a rocket war against Israel. And then there's more to say about the story, but it's the paving of the road for Hamas to take power is a direct result of American policy in that part of the world. Any thoughts on that, Onkar, before we flesh out more of the story?
No, I think that captures well the tragedy of our policy. If one thinks of it, if what we were trying to do is oppose the people who had launched the attacks in 9/11, that you're 5 years, 6 years later, and what you're doing is you're helping the same mentality get political power over a whole area in the Middle East. nobody would have said, if you told them after 9/11, oh yeah, that in 5 years, 6 years, that's what we're going to be doing, everybody would have said you're crazy. I mean, so as I said, it started off as we're going to end states that sponsor terrorism, and now it's we're going to give a whole terrorist regime that is explicit from its inception that our goal is to eradicate the state of Israel from the face of the globe. We're going to help these people get into power. And it seems absurd, but if you understand the actual ideas that are driving them, there's a logic to how they came to this. And it is true that if you take the altruist view of love your enemy, well, here we're helping our enemy gain power. And there's a kind of pretense that, well, if they wield political power, this will moderate them. It forces them to govern. They have to provide schools and hospitals for people in Gaza. So after they came into power, instead of the Western world, and I think it's certainly true in America, but I think it's true in Israel as well. It's part of why they were unprepared, I think, for October 7th. It's hard to face the reality of you've got people right across the border who want to murder every man, woman, and child in your territory. It's easier to tell yourself a story. No, them being in political power will moderate them. And, well, they're religious, and most religious people have a kind of view, well, there's something good and sort of character building about religion. So if Hamas is in power for a while, what you'll see is something different than when they were on the outskirts, sort of clamoring for political power. So there was a delusion that they're not as committed to their goals as they actually are. And so it's part of what was, I think, surprised the policy makers on October 7th.
Let's pick up from there, because I was saying that by 2006, 2007, Hamas was waging rocket wars. So just to add a little more texture to that, one of the biggest confrontations at that time between Israel and its adversaries was a war in 2006 that was in part launched by Hamas in the Gaza Strip, but the main force was Hezbollah in Lebanon. And remember, as I was saying earlier, that Hezbollah gained greater political power. It entered government for the first time in a significant way in Lebanon as a result of America's pressure to have more elections and to allow Islamists to enter. And so that was 2006. And I'm going to skip over some of the details, but then 2008-9, there's another war, this time even more significant, many more rockets are fired from Gaza into Israel. 2012, the same thing happens. 2014, the same thing happens. 2021, the same thing happens. And we'll come to 2023 and the attack of October 7th in a moment. Important to see throughout this repeated cycle is that, and this goes back to the very beginning, as you said, part of the reaction to Hamas gaining so much power in the Palestinian territories was this, partly the pothole theory of politics, which is they have to run the schools, have to fix potholes, that they'll moderate their crazy, what seems like crazy ideas. They can't possibly believe that when they have to take on the responsibilities of government. That was just not true. And that was borne out by the fact that what Hamas did was acquire more weapons and train their children to become so-called martyrs and plan more attacks at each interval that they had the opportunity to. But the piece that has to be recognized, and again, this is partly the US policy, partly an affliction of Western countries more generally, which is the immediate reaction after Hamas gains power is, we can't deal with these people. What, are we going to let them into the UN? Are we going to have them visit the White House? It's unthinkable. And indeed, it is unthinkable. And so one of the things that happens is we have to, quote, isolate them. And we're going to hold off sending more aid to the Palestinians. How long did that last? It didn't last. It didn't actually happen, because while there was talk about putting Hamas in a box and not sending aid to the Palestinians, aid continued to flow. And we know that. And it came from various sources. There were some controls put in place. And we know how good those controls were looking back now, because whatever those controls were over how the foreign aid reached the Palestinians, we know that significant amounts of foreign money were necessary and in fact spent on new weapons and new tunnels and more means by which to wage war on Israel. And we know that it's happened since 2006 because we've seen the climax of it, at least the climax so far, on October 7th. And this goes to some of the shocking aspects of what Hamas was doing. So one of the things I've been telling people when I've been doing talks in the last year or so, and people are really dumbfounded at the attacks and horrified by the attacks that happened on October 7th. That was not planned the night before, and not even a month before. The scale of planning and the subterranean construction and the tunnels and the sophistication of the tunnels and the training of protocols for what to do to hide the tunnels and what the kind of Hamas training for their own people was and how to use the tunnels, that is a years and years long process. And there was advanced warnings of it, foreshadowings of the tunnels for years. And this all continues to happen under the noses of Western donors, including the United States. And they keep telling themselves that they have found some magical way to make sure that the foreign aid and food that's sent into Gaza is only for so-called innocent people. And that, I think, is a delusion. It's a rationalization because it's too difficult to admit that so many people in that area support Hamas. And they did at the time that they voted, their parents voted, and now they still support Hamas. Many of them do. I leave the possibility open that there are some innocent people in the Palestinian terrorists who are unwilling victims of Hamas. And I think that's definitely possible. We knew that some of that was true beforehand. But I think the overwhelming fact is it's difficult to build a tunnel network of that scale. And I think it dwarfs the London Underground in terms of its length. It's difficult to do that and have so many openings into people's homes and still believe that every single family that is impacted by the tunnel under their house was completely unaware of it. They had no hand in doing it, nothing to do with covering it up for many years of construction. So there's a real self-deception necessary here. And I think this goes back to the premise of altruism, is that it prevents you from thinking about morality in a rational way. It prevents you from actually judging people and figuring out what it looks like to evaluate both your enemies and the people who are complicit in it and the many steps in between those two. And I think this is an important part of the story of how Hamas gains power, because it continues to do exactly what it promised to do at its founding and its founding documents. It has never said we will. In fact, it goes out of its way to say that they would do another October 7th if they had the chance. They keep telling us what they plan to do, as did Osama bin Laden, as did other Islamist groups. It is America and other Western regimes that don't want to believe that that's the case. They tell themselves lies so that they don't have to admit that they're dealing with evil.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point, and it's important to understand the whole mentality of the policymakers in the West. And this is one of the consequences of altruism. So part of the way it empowers evil is this slogan of love your enemy. It's one of the most perverse moral slogans that has ever existed. It's the opposite of justice. But most people, when they hear that, and I'm supposed to live by this, I can't really do that. But if you're not willing to rebel against the very idea, in the way that Ayn Rand says, the whole altruist framework and morality is perverse and needs to be rejected. If you're not ready to do that, one thing that many people do to cope is, I'm not really aiding evil. They're not that evil. They're misguided, misunderstood. If only they had a chance, they would orient in a different way, and to make it more palatable to yourself of what you're doing. And so people live in this world of A and non-A. They half know that Hamas is evil. Everybody there knows they were building a massive network of tunnels. As you were saying, it's impossible to not know that. But you sort of half know that and half tell yourself, well, but they're not really evil. They'll moderate and so on because it makes it, yeah, we're pouring millions and millions into aid into Gaza. Like, why would we do that if they're completely evil? So you have to tell yourself a story, and it is the you can't understand what's going on in the Middle East if you don't see the morality involved and the way in which the morality necessarily corrupts people's cognitive processes.
So I think it's good to circle back to the point we started with. And one way to put it is, if we go back to 2001, and if we told people 20 years later, when America withdraws from Afghanistan, the Taliban will be back in power, it will be chaos, America will have lost, in effect, Afghanistan, it would have been a catastrophic failure. And I think if we told people that America would have been in Iraq for 15 plus 16 years, and that also was a failure, did not advance America's security. If we had said all those things, and if we had said as well that throughout the 2010s and early decades of this century, the Europe would be attacked by Islamists in Paris and in Brussels, and there would be attacks on transit systems. There would be attempts to bring down airliners over the United States. There would be a period where, I think in the 2015, as Islamic State was rising, that people were leaving Western countries. They were flocking to live under Islamic State. And people may have forgotten what Islamic State looked like. It had as much territory as the United Kingdom, and it created a new caliphate, as it called itself, and it attracted people. It didn't repel people by its savagery. It attracted people who wanted to live under its black flag, and that was happening 15 years after 9/11. That's the state of the world. And I think that a crucial part of how we got there just is that the American response was a failure. America disarmed itself and empowered its own enemies as a result of the pernicious moral ideas that were perverting its foreign policy. Now, if we had told people all of this in 2001, I think they would try to slap your face. They would be indignant. They would be angry. There was righteous indignation at the time. For a moment at the time, I remember it. I'm sure you do as well, Onkar. People had the expectation that we'd solve this problem. America's going to put its foot down. There's going to be no more of this. And as you said earlier in the conversation, there was a view that we have to, quote, end states that sponsor terrorism. We have to change our policy. None of that happened. And in fact, that nightmare scenario is the one that we lived through in the last 2 decades. And I think and this goes to October 7th, if you had told people that Israel would have its own 9/11 20 plus years later, conducted by Hamas, I think they would have been astonished by that. I think more than astonished. I think horrified, as everyone rightly was horrified, but that we would still be afflicted by this menace of the Islamist movement so many years later, and that it would be so daring, I think would just be demoralizing to people. And I think there's more to say about the reactions to October 7th, but I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yes, the other aspect, I think, that again, that we were warning about after 9/11, that if we don't get this right, if our response isn't guided by the right principles, and then those principles put into actual action, including military action in the Middle East, that we're not going to be able to live that down. That is that an error or mistake or worse of that on that scale in response to an attack of this magnitude of 9/11, it's going to be a disaster, and a disaster for decades and decades. I mean, part of the reason we spent so much time on the response to 9/11 is we knew it either can dramatically improve conditions of freedom in the world, or it's going to dramatically worsen them. And what has happened, as you were saying, is to dramatically worsen them. And if you had said after 9/11 that, so you said, just saying that Israel's going to have an attack like this 2 decades later, people would have been astonished. How can you possibly say that? We're dramatically changing our policy, and we're going to have something very different in the Middle East 2 decades from now. It's not going to be like this. And then if you told them, and with Israel not only will suffer an attack like that, but on American university campuses and a little more broadly in the Western world, there's going to be support expressed, moral support for Hamas or the attackers and against Israel. I think people would have said you're certifiable and you belong in an insane institution. That so that people would celebrate it, and this is part of what was remarkable about 9/11 and why there was a real opportunity for a change. There was in the U.S. a a real genuine patriotism that happened after 9/11, that it was some understanding that the US was attacked for what's good about it. It's the skyline of New York City. It's I mean, they tried to attack the the Capitol in DC. It's what the institutions that stand for freedom, government, business, prosperity. These are one of the targets of 9/11. And there was a widespread understanding in the US that there's something real. We're dealing with a real evil here, that it's not about some grievance about our policy in the Middle East. It's some hatred of America for what's good about America. There was, I think, on a part of a lot of the American people, there was that response. And the consequence was there were some people who are anti-American in America. They were very reluctant to speak out after 9/11 because they would face so much opposition from the American people, that there's really, like, you're either on the side of America and what's good about America, or you're on the side of the terrorists. And if what your response to 9/11 is, it's to criticize and attack America, as a response to October 7th is to criticize and attack Israel. If people had done that after 9/11, they would have faced a lot of backlash. And so they were very reluctant to do it. And that was, I think, even more evident around the world, of Europe, the European response, for instance, and European newspapers and so on, saying that their stand with America in various forms. They put that point there. This is why there was a real opportunity for change, because the evil of these regimes and this ideology was palpable for people to see, and the better people had that response. And if you fast forward now to October 7th, you have these protests on campus that are pro-Hamas, anti-Israel. And the better people have some, again, a reaction to, really, like, on campuses in Harvard and Princeton, at our elite universities, we've got students siding with killers and mass murderers and people dedicated to wiping out the state of Israel because it's a free country. They have a sense that, yeah, there's something very perverse here, and there is something perverse about it. But if you ask of these people pushing back against the protesters, do they have anything positive to say? Do they have any strategy to offer about what we should be doing in response to this threat? I think it's essentially zero. They have nothing to say. There's something very perverse about the people who are siding with Hamas, but we have nothing to say about how to deal with this. And again, the policy after 9/11, I think, is the basic explanation for why they have nothing to say. Because in many people's minds, the way it stands is, well, we tried a strong military response to actively oppose these people. That's what we did in Afghanistan. That's what supposedly, that's what we did in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And that we were trying to bring freedom to and none of it worked. So what can you do? We've tried a policy of strength and war, and that didn't work. It doesn't look like a policy of appeasement will work. And they have nothing positive to say about how to move forward. So they can respond to the evil of people siding with Hamas, but we have no forward direction. And that's a consequence of our response to 9/11.
Well, I think we should wrap up and just come back to you with any final thoughts. One reflection is that as you pointed out, and it's come up a few times in the conversation, the Institute has invested a lot of time and resources in responding to and analyzing 9/11. And we thought it was an opportunity, we thought it was important, and we thought ultimately that it's a philosophical issue, that it's not exclusively to be understood as a policy question. It's defined fundamentally by the moral premises that were dominant in the administration and dominant in the culture, and that's how we should look at this issue, both what's animating the enemy and what makes them evil, and also how to approach the solution and why the policy that was adopted was doomed, I think, from the beginning, precisely because of the altruistic premises shaping it. So we invested a lot in doing that, and it cost us. The people are really upset with us for a long time, and it's understandable that people were, because I think they hoped that this would work. But in the end, the facts bore out that you cannot succeed by being self-sacrificial. And the more that America went down that path, the more disaster it brought upon itself. And so I think this is a crucial way in which people misunderstand the decade since 9/11. It's not because, as you put it, we tried being strong and that failed. It's we weren't really clear about what it means to pursue our interests. We didn't have a conception of it. And in fact, we acted on the wrong moral premise. We acted on the self-sacrificial premise, and that colored everything that we did. And the consequences of that are reverberating all the way through to the present. And let me hand it back to you if you have any final thoughts on that.
I'll just say this, that after 9/11, there was, as we've been saying, some real recognition that we need to rethink our foreign policy and what we're doing in the Middle East and how we conceive of America's interests. After the fall of Afghanistan and after October 7th, there is the same reason to rethink and indeed to revisit the response to 9/11. The culture and the policymakers and government, and including like opposition parties, no one's encouraging you to rethink, but it doesn't change the fact that we need and desperately need to rethink the philosophic principles that are guiding our foreign policy. It's literally a matter of life and death.
So let me close by recommending a couple of resources from the Institute. One is the book that I mentioned at the beginning, Winning the Unwinnable War, that looks at the response to 9/11 through 2008. And then the follow-up book to that is Failing to Confront Islamic Totalitarianism, What Went Wrong After 9/11. That one spans 2001 through 2021. And we encourage you to take a look at that. And just to underscore your observation, Onkar, I think that one of the most important things that comes out from reading those resources that we encourage people to take a look at is that the way forward really hinges on having a positive conception of one's interests, of thinking about what is the ideal, what do we want to accomplish, and then that is the guiding direction. That's a really profound moral issue that Ayn Rand is distinctive on, is that you need to be guided by positive ideals in life. And what we have in our culture is the opposite. It's dominated by corrupt moral thinking, and that shapes people's view, and it demoralizes and defeats our efforts to defend ourselves. So I would encourage people to take a look at that, because it is a very depressing topic. It's really important, and that shouldn't be a deterrent to thinking about it. And as you were saying, there are continual opportunities to rethink with each of these disastrous outcomes and reverberations, but it's important that people do that. And I really encourage everyone to explore and become better educated about what actually happened in the last 20 years so they can better understand events like October 7th. And with that, thank you for joining us. We'll be back next time.